back. So it's a bit confusing, but we try to handle that. To whom we speak or should speak. Yeah, welcome. So we shift our perspective now to the non-educational context, to the art institutions. And the title of this panel is What an Institution Should Do. And so the question that was put was like, or first of all, an observation that was made that institutions, art institutions today are very good in adapting or in acknowledging current questions, political questions, topics, and are very good in thematizing, but maybe not that good in also incorporating these kind of questions and political changes within their own structure. Or might be the question, in what way they really reflect their way of operating within the social and political changes. So the question was, what is the responsibility of institutions? When we talked before, Florian, Malzacher, Silvia, Bottiroli, who I will introduce very soon, we were wondering in which kind of phase of institutional critique we might be, and somehow we thought it's maybe not a strong time of that people or artists, young artists, older artists, questioning institutions as such. But there are some changes in the surveys, maybe. We talked about that there are collective artistic directions nowadays in some of our home countries, that artistic directions are like adapting to questions of age, race, and gender. But also there is the question how much the structure itself are changing. And so we thought maybe we are not so much becoming busy now with criticizing current institutional structures, but asking what an institution should do or what we desire them to do, and also we might to discuss alternative ways of organizing, like artist organizations and so on. So very briefly, I'd like to introduce you to the two guests of today of this panel. This is Silvia Bottiroli, sorry, the E's and O's in your name, sorry, Bottiroli, yeah? And Florian Malzacher. Silvia, due to some difficulties in private differences in her family, could not come to Zagreb, unfortunately. Although I guess you were also quite looking forward to meet finally some people in flesh and to touch and to see you live in presence. But we are very happy that the technique seemed to work. Welcome. And yeah. So we'll start with Silvia. And I think both of you have quite some experiences in being involved, deeply involved in institutions, but both of you are working independently as freelance at the moment. Silvia is a curator, researcher, and educator, and she worked many years, I think 4 years, in the festival Santa Carangelo in Italy as an artistic director. And the festival is, those of you who know it, is quite particular. Maybe we also mentioned that later, I don't know exactly, but it's existing since 1978, and it's quite embedded in a small city or even village, which is, so we could say, becomes part of the festival. So the last 3 years, she was the art director of Das Theater, what was formerly known as Das Arts, and at a certain moment got part of this higher structured academy of dance and theater in the University of Art in Amsterdam. And but she also worked as a freelancer, as a curator for other, together with other structures and institutions, and very much involved also in discursive programs, like I'd like to mention the May Events, a program that was initiated or organized by Kunstfestival and Verreucht in Ghent. The May Event, the name is referring to May 1968, and so it's a platform for artists and researchers who are very busy with art connected with social and political issues. and also especially artists and researchers not from the European or Western context. And she's also very much into writing and teaching, and maybe that's enough for now. Florian, also, when we met, so you were working for 6 years, I guess, as a co-curator of the Steirischer Herbst Festival in Graz, a multidisciplinary festival, and for 3 years as the artist director of the Impulse Festival, an interesting festival that, because also, not last but not least, because it's situated in 3 different cities at the same time, Mülheim, Düsseldorf, and Cologne. And, but also there, but of course now, you were very much, I think, with discursive programs and always trying to, as far as I receive it, trying to connect the topics of what you're busy with, or with the format you embed and you present them. So, and I think one of you will talk about it, maybe more specific. It's the Artist Organization International, but I'd like to mention also Truth is Concrete, the 24 hours, 7 days marathon camp where 250 artists, researchers, curators, practitioners were performing, lecturing, and it was a lot about the current state of arts and their political involvement and contexts. And it also appears as a book later, was edited as a book, and Training for the Future, together with Jonas Dahl or the Art of Assembly, first started as an online format with guest talks and lectures. So there are a lot of different formats, and also you're writing a lot, curator, dramaturg, writer, and also a lot about curating, and quite some books about collectors, artist collectors like Emily Protocol, Nature Theatre of Oklahoma, and what was that? Forced Entertainment. What we also can call some more like little organizations, even, I would say. So maybe we leave it like that. So Silvia and me agreed on that we start with you, Florian. Sorry. So we start with you because Florian will, both of them will have a 10 minutes, around 10 minutes little introduction in a topic they are interested in this context. And since Florian will start with more artist-related examples of organizations, and Silvia with more art institutions-related idea of there. So, please, Florian.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. It's really great to be part of the Klassentreffen, I guess the reunion was the word I was looking for, which I accepted possibility. So then I thought that actually I'm not so sure that I'm the right person to talk about art institutions, because I'm now for a couple of years not part of one anymore. But since I wanted to be here, I said yes anyway. And then, but I think what I would like to talk a little bit about makes actually quite sense in the light of what we talked yesterday about, but also today. Because on one hand it might seem like a very specific example of institution that I'm talking about, artist organizations. I will explain it a bit more what it is, but at the same time it is related to a lot of things that were mentioned already. And maybe before, to also make it clear a bit from the standpoint I'm speaking about, I just wanted to add maybe to the discussion before very briefly, and I think it's a little bit past certain strategies of socially engaged art were, I would say, dismissed, or at least put very much in the question position. I just would maybe want to mention that I think that the tradition of socially engaged art, and even traditions that call themselves useful art, came very much from a position of proposing the system, the capitalist and its own system. So I'm not supporting it. And I know that the wording and how history goes, certain things are appropriated, or certain words are used differently than in different contexts. But I just would say, for me, talking about socially engaged art or even useful art would come from a different background. It doesn't need to mean maybe it means to be in service, but not so much in service of the maybe the current system we are working on. And I'm saying this because I think what I want to talk about, artist organizations, comes a little bit from this background. With artist organizations, I mean not organizations, I mean organizations founded by artists, but not for the purpose to enable the artistic work, but as the artistic work. So the artist organizations I'm talking about in this definition is the artistic work of these artists. And of course that's a very wide field. Just maybe in terms of the footnotes where it comes from, I'm basing it a bit on a project that you mentioned that I did together with the artist Jonas Stahl and the curator Jana Varsha a couple of years ago. It was a project called Artist Organizations International. And since I will mention some artist organizations just to give you context, but I don't have time to go into that. If you're interested, the website of Artist Organizations International is still somewhere online, but I guess many of the organizations I mentioned you will know. So the project stems from the observation that actually even on the level of names, in recent years a lot of artist organizations appeared. Artistic projects called schools, institutes, academies, universities, etc. So that even on the level of names appeared a lot of institutions there. Just to mention some of them to also show that this is of course a very wide range. A lot of them don't have very much to do with each other, maybe in some way. There are, I would say, alternative political organizations bringing different using names or the concepts of existing organizations to reverse them. Maybe the Jonas Stahl's New World Summit would be one of them. Tanja Bruguera's Immigrant Movement International, or also Tanja Bruguera's Instituto de Activismo, Hannah Arendt, Milo Raus International Institute for Political Murder, Center for Political Beauty, Remington Martin's Institute for Human Activities, playing with the idea of church also exists, Reverend Billy's The Church of Stop Shopping. So there would be a full list of it, and of course it's also obvious in this context, you will know about it, maybe I want to mention it, a lot of them are in the field of knowledge production, knowledge transfer, education and so on. And when I say it's a current trend, of course there's always predecessors to it, which I'm not going into, but of course, for example, in the field of education, Joseph Beuys Free International University for Creativity and Interdisciplinary Research from '73 would be one, and also his famous sentence, "Being a teacher is my greatest work of art," would very much relate to it. I mean, there are more current examples, Studiella School of Art, Ahmed Öğüt, Silent University where which is from and for refugees, a self-organized university. I would say maybe PAF, Performing Arts Forum, would maybe also go in this direction and so on. So just to say this, but also I would say artist organization can also be, because it's an artist organization, they can be also in the realm of fiction at least. And I think many of them are at least partly in the realm of imagination, of course, of radical imagination, but some are really almost completely in the realm of fiction. Like, for example, Yael Bakana's Jewish Renaissance movement in Poland, a huge movement which only exists in film and in some congresses. Or also more on the more popular side of these microstates that are founded as fictitious or sometimes semi-fictitious state organizations. So just to say, this is the wide field. I'd like to talk a little bit about what I think artist organizations are and would be the definition we kind of had when we did this project. So of course, they are founded by artists. Artist organizations seek for continuity of cultural and political engagement that is not just based in personal interest in authorship. This is, I think, really interesting. So it's not a single author. I mean, some of them you can discuss, of course, there are also alpha males and alpha women involved often in artist organization, but the general idea is, of course, not to have a single author, which also brings in a different question of sustainability. So an artist organization can change the personnel. For example, Wochenklausur in Vienna exists for 30 years now, and it's a completely different group of people doing it now. So it could bring also, so it questions the idea, the figure of the author, but also has to do with I know the word sustainability was put into question yesterday, but till we find another one, I use it. So at the same time, the artist organization also questions the form of organization itself by emphasizing urgency, change, and criticality, and it's a living organism. So they only function as collaboration, obviously, even though some of them have clear hierarchies. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but even there, collaboration has to be in focus, otherwise it doesn't make a sense. And these collaborations permanently challenge also internal power relations within the group, I would say. And of course, it's the paradigm of collective work very much is in this, and we would argue that arts organizations put this idea of collective work, push it a step further. Obviously, artist organizations seek for structural engagement. So, and maybe one of the, for us, we kind of said, for us it looked like that there's a paradigm shift happening. I don't need to explain that for many decades now, the paradigm of the project was the dominant working model, and we all know that there were good reasons coming from the, maybe more from the object, from the artistic work as such, to the idea of the project, the process as focusing on processual working, questioning representation, etc. I don't need to go into this. But we also don't need to go into that. We also know the pitfalls of the concept of the project, which is, to put it very briefly, is connected to the precarious situation that a lot of us work in, because project of course always ends, and often very fast. The project is also based on certain dependencies from outside, etc. I'm not elaborating this further, but we thought that the idea of the organization is maybe the next step of it. So it's the next shift from the idea of the project to the idea of the organization that demand more structural engagement, more durability, and a long-term vision in a way. And artist organizations also have the possibility to push the concept of self-governance to another level, both within and outside of the art world. For us, it was interesting that a lot of these artist organizations, all of them that we looked at, propose social and political agendas as well, so that there's not a differentiation between this, and that they see themselves as part of a political struggle in very different ways. It also relates to, like I said, or somebody said just before, in relation to all other kinds of institutions and discourses. So that I think a lot of these artist organizations have a strong interest also in collaboration with other agents in the fields of politics, society, science, community economy, education, etc. So that these borders are also a bit questioned. I would just briefly say, for now, we can maybe later go a little bit more into it later, that so for us the idea of the artist organization is a consequence out of the pitfalls of the concept of the project, but it also, of course, is based in other artistic developments of recent, but also past decades. I mean, one of them was mentioned. It's of course clearly embedded in the idea of the social turn. Claire Bishop was mentioned, and so on. I will not go much into it, but to just quote Pablo Helguera, in practices that are symbolic and actual at the same time. But the other thing next to this is, and the overlaps, of course, it's also, in a way, maybe a fourth wave of institutional critique, if you wish. So also not you all know that, but I think maybe in the context of the room, it's also interesting to bring this context in, so I briefly mention it again. The first wave of institutional critique in the 60s and 70s with protagonists like Robert Smith and Daniel Bourne and Malzacher, etc., of course, seeing themselves very much outside of the institution. Resistance, putting up a resistance to the institution. The second wave, maybe from the late 80s on, with Andrea Fraser, Fred Wilson, others, of course, seeing this much more complicated already and looking at the role of the artist within the institution. So kind of like where institutional critique becomes also an analytic tool from the inside. And then one could say a third wave of institutional critique in the 2000s, early 2000s, which is also overlapping with the concept of new institutionalism, basically is that the structure of the art institution itself tries to embed this institutional critique already. So Andrea Fraser said, from the critique of institution to an institution of critique. And this is, I think very much also still the situation I guess we're working with our other institutions. And it's of course double-sided. On one hand, it's good that these institutions do this. On the other hand, it is like not only style often criticizes, means that often it's only a symbolic integration of critique, only superficially, that the political integration of minorities is performed, but at the same time, social inequality is maintained, etc. So that institutional critique becomes also a mechanism of control within new modes of governmentality, precisely through its very act of internationalization. Just to give, before I come to an end, to maybe a bit anecdotal examples for the problem. Also, one example for this problem is that at Occupy Wall Street 10 years ago now, also a group Occupy Museums evolved out of this, and they went to different museums and also tried to occupy them and so on. And when they went to the MoMA, of course, immediately the curators came and said, yeah, let's talk, what are your demands, and so on. And they refused to talk to them, because they said, but we know that you would agree with us. We have no way of opposing it, because you already internalized the critique so much, but at the same time, MoMA is still MoMA, and it doesn't help to maybe talking to the board will change something, but not to the curators who are already on this side. So like an embedded opposition, which is at the same time is on the payroll and so on. We all know, I think also maybe from own experience a little bit about this. So I think the idea of artist organization is also a little bit an act of emancipation towards this. And also then an anecdote in a way, Ahmed Öğüt, when he founded the Silent University, it was first happening in the context of Take Modern, and he said like, but actually it was only symbolic, but suddenly I felt like not being the artist speaking with a famous, powerful art organization, but I was an organization myself, and at this moment it was only him. But already by calling him the Silent University, he felt like he has a different leverage in this conversation. And as I said, this is anecdotal, but there's something to it. It's also bringing you into a different game. So today, as it was also mentioned, I think there are several things happening in this realm. So there are artist organizations, like I described them. Then, as Silke mentioned, for example, in the German context where I know it best, but also I think also in other countries at the moment, there's this tendency of giving artistic directorship to collectives, look for diversity, etc. So we'll have to see what that means. That, for example, in Germany, suddenly, after all these years, suddenly people of color becoming directors of state theaters or city theaters is completely new. But does it change something? We will have to observe, or is it just new institutionalism step 2 or whatever? And then the organization, like I found in this context, was very interesting. Listened yesterday of private-public partnerships and so on. So this is maybe the field we are there are the other aspects we are in. And I just maybe want to stop with a nice quote by Ernesto Laclau. Insofar as an act of institution has been successful, a forgetting of the origins tend to occur. The system of possible alternatives tends to vanish, and the traces of the original continuity fade. In this way, the institution tends to assume the form of a mere objective presence. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. So, yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to go immediately to continue with you, Silvia, because I guess there are some questions that could be made as a response to Florian's contribution and maybe already also embedded in your contribution. So,
yes, I can go straight. You can hear me well, right? Okay, everyone in the room. I'm very sorry that I don't see most of you in the room, and very thankful to the whole organization and Florian and Silke for accepting me to contribute like this from remote. It's a pity for me not to be there, of course, a big pity, but still I'm very glad that I can at least participate in this panel. So thank you, really. I know it's not easy to be there in this hybrid mode. Yes, this morning we agreed with Silke it would be better to start with Florian because in a way what you Florian just proposed is also a way of decentralizing a bit the question from the institution, and I guess it's a very good entry point to the institution. So my attempt will now be in the next 10 minutes or so to go back to the core of our art institution. So not as artistic organizations, but really as, a possible definition of an institution, I guess, is I got to this definition once, which is that any institution is the crystallization of a complex set of processes of negotiation between different parties. We can debate the definition, but I will just really try to focus on institutions that are indeed built out of processes and where different subjects, different discourses, different set of powers also are in place. And in a way, I decided also to try to tackle the question of today in a way from the perspective that we have to engage with artistic institutions no matter what, and that, as Chantal Mouffe wrote in a very famous text that probably many of you have read, withdrawing from the institution is not, let's say, is not such a good idea. At least because they are still there, they are powerful, and they have resources. And there are also things, I guess, that only art institution can do. And maybe one place where we can try to go today is also what can happen indeed in the collaboration between artistic institutions and artist organizations, which are more than artistic projects, as Florian just said. And maybe just adding, I find myself more often working around institutions, also with students, with artists, and also with students in the university. And often I found myself in the position of really pleading for an engagement with institutions. I also found myself in a way very difficult and at some point unworkable situation of working within institutions. So, and in this very moment I'm talking from the position of just resigning from a big institution and deciding not to work in a position, let's say, of power within an institution anymore, at least not for now. So I'm also myself a bit ambivalent about that. So just that you know in a way from where I'm speaking. Two things to start with, and then I would like to try to outline in a way two sets of problems that I see with institutions today, and from there we can see where we can go with the conversation. To start with, I must say that I very much like something in the title of our panel, which is the focus on the doing. Now, what should institutions do? And I guess this is a question that obsesses me, which is the question about the doing of art, the doing of theater, the doing of institutions, which I think we can also, which is for me, an interesting shift from what institutions are, from being busy with what they are, into being busy with what they do, so what they could do, what they should do, but also what they are actually doing, and maybe what are the gaps in between that. And looking at the doings is for me also an invitation to look in a way at the possibility of use of the institution. And this is maybe more a suggestion for the conversation later. But in a way, if we focus on what institutions do, then we can also focus on what we can do with them, within them, and in a way how we can use them. So what are institutions for? Which is just very basic questions, I guess, for art institutions, who they are for. And both these questions, I think, are relevant if we ask them in relation to what institutions actually do and in relation to what they should do. Because very often, I guess, the answers would be different. And recently I started with students trying to use the concept of peer use as articulated by Sarah Ahmed in a very famous lecture that you might know, to indeed artistic institutions. She also does it already in the lecture. She really discussed in depth, in a way, the diversity of work, the certain kind of work that needs to be done within institutions. But I think also some other suggestions in the text are quite interesting and also playful in some way, as a way of tackling how we could use existing institutions. Or, of course, then the question also comes of what is the space that we have, what is the agency, etc. So I just wanted to keep these two ideas of the doings and the use as maybe possible generative tools for today's conversation and for tackling institutions. Indeed, not from a perspective of mere critique, but also from a perspective of imagination and engagement, which is, I think, more than just criticizing, although, of course, critique is also important. And I will start with critique, indeed. So we discussed in preparation with Florian and Silke how we look at institutions today, in a way, what sets of problems we see within institutions. I would like to try to underline two. The first is something that Silke already said, and you said already in your introduction. In our preparation, you also, Silke, went back to a quote from Sarah Van Heen, from the contribution that Sarah gave at the Symposium, The Fantastic Institution, that was curated by Ines Quackels and the Buddha team in Portrait in 2017. And then it was followed by a kind of free school the year after, which I also co-curated. And Sarah Van Heen is a Belgian artist, who is also one of the artists, for example, now very busy with building up an artist organization called Bodies of Knowledge. Maybe we can go back to that. She gave a beautiful lecture that you can find online in 2017. And at some point, she really said basic institutions should, quote, practice alternative politics instead of presenting art programs about alternative politics. And I think she really goes straight to the point. Which is, I guess, one big set of problems that we have with art institutions at the moment. Which is also interesting somehow, because I think it tackles a certain friction between reality and fiction within the institution. Because of course arts institutions are there to present and represent. As Florian said, also the symbolic layer is there, is very much present, is very much part of what art institutions do. And at the same time, I think what we are witnessing, I guess, in the last years very much is that there is an increased, let's say, awareness about the need of tackling the need for alternative politics. But then this is happening very much at the level of representation and at the level of the program, rather than at the level of implementing alternative politics within the institution itself. Which is also a shift where, on the one hand, the responsibility is given to the artist, but also, as we said earlier today, then it becomes a form of thematization. So it becomes a theme rather than becoming an active action. So, for example, I think we see that a lot, at least in I would say at least in Western Europe, but I guess more than just there. Finally, some issues are on top of or the forefront of political agendas, like equality and gender and race equality, diversity, need for inclusion, etc. And they are very much tackled on a thematic level by artistic institutions. So exhibitions and performances that are about that, or in the best case scenarios, artists who are presented who are more diverse, etc. while the internal organization of the institution and how the institution works and the actual politics that it implements are not really challenged, are not necessarily changed. So I think this is one set of problems, and I believe it's interesting exactly because we cannot easily dismiss the symbolic or representative layer when we talk about art. So of course it's also about representation in a way, and the doing is also about representing certain things, certain realities, certain subjectivities, but then an institution is also just a collective body and a set of rules and ways of operating and tackling the actual internal structure and how it relates to the outside world is also extremely important. So we can maybe go deeper there later. But then on the other hand, another set of problems that I see, and that may sound in contradiction with what I just said, for me it is not, so I'll try to articulate, is that I have the feeling, or I mean my observation and from my perspective, that arts institutions are becoming more and more agents of social and cultural policies, rather than facilitators of aesthetic experiences. And from my perspective, in a way, institutions are both, and have to, of course, have to be agents of social, cultural politics and policies, but it will also be very important to, in a way, to separate, which is indeed maybe an invitation to think of the actual and the symbolic, and the actual and the representation, and the real and the fictional layer as two intertwined yet separated layers. Because of course political agendas are given to institutions, and especially to public institutions or to institutions that are publicly funded. This is how it should be, as we know. But I have the impression that institutions are, or in general, are kind of gradually losing the capability to respond instead of to react. And to respond, in my understanding, means to receive agendas, to receive input, to receive demands, but also to pose and process them, and in a way to decide how to tackle them on the different layers of the institution itself. For example, I mean, just to give a concrete example and to make it clear what I'm trying to talk about, when it comes to diversity, which is in many, at least in many Western European countries, finally becoming a word that seems to be, I mean, a word, a concept, a practice that seems to be important in the cultural field. This is very much there in policy documents and in many institutions. And as we know, and as also Sarah Ahmed writes in a lecture, for example, I mean, stating something and putting something into policy documents is very often a way not to do the work. So just to say, yeah, but this is part of our values, etc., and then you don't really look at how you are doing the work. But in arts organization and arts institution in particular, then this diversity is into policy documents, and then diversity is often thematized and in the artistic programs, or in the, as I said, in the best case scenario, is present in the diversity of artists that are being presented by the institution itself. While the internal organization is not that often challenged, I think. Now, Florian, you were making the example of, yes, more people of color directing institutions in Germany, great. I also wonder how, indeed, in reality, how much this is happening in general in other countries, and now based in Italy, where this is for sure not there yet, and also there are very few women in position of power in artistic institutions, but also in general, the diversity of the audience is a huge issue, I think. So I guess the institution could look at that agenda from different perspectives, and maybe if, for example, the need for more diversity in the field would be addressed by diversifying the institution and really engaging more diverse audience, so really doing the work of talking to, with, and listening to more people in the city, then maybe what could be kept is also an idea which I think is very empowering of what kind of experience an artistic institution can provide to its audience and to and even to the artists. And there, so this is the last sheet that I would like to do before concluding. I mean, my sense, and as Silke also said, I have been busy with festivals more often, and maybe festivals are a very peculiar kind of arts institution. But my sense is that arts institutions can and have to do many different things, but one thing that they can do is to provide or to facilitate aesthetic experiences, and I mean encounters between individuals, communities, and artworks, encounters that are not easily, that are not possible to comprehend or to own, to possess. What I mean by aesthetic experience is probably the experience that we have sometimes in the relation with an artwork. And my sense is that art institutions, and maybe festivals in particular, can create contexts where these kind of encounters can be enhanced very much, which are singular experiences, which are experiences that are not the same for everybody, although they are shared experiences, which are experiences that we cannot define, in that sense that we cannot own. So something that is about us, that affects us, but is not something that we can possess. It's not something that when in an aesthetic experience, I cannot say this is me and this is my experience. So it's singular and it's very much shared. And ideally, my sense is that aesthetic experience also has a huge political value, because that's where we can share the same experience, not exactly having the same, and where subjectivities are completely, maybe not dissolved, but are really decentralized and become relational in ways that are more difficult to experience in other fields of experience that we normally have. And what I'm describing, I think I'm very well aware that what I'm describing is more often the encounter that we have with an artwork. And in a way, in that sense, I'm also giving a lot of agency to the arts institution as a subject that can facilitate this kind of experience. But still, I think this is one of the doings of the arts institutions that we should not forget about. So, which is very much in the how programs are curated, for example, in how space and time are work in our team. So it's a lot of curatorial work, let's say, curatorial layers, but still, and that's what I also meant by respond. No? So I think also politically certain responses can be articulated by arts institutions, focusing on what they can actually do that other institutions cannot, which is indeed connected to aesthetic experience and to the realm of aesthetics as the realm of art that they work with. I guess we can go there if that's interesting later in the conversation, as well as I would very much like to go back, if that's interesting, to the notion of peer reviews in relation to the institution. And then maybe just a small final note, just a small, not a response to Florian, but something that came to mind listening to you, Florian, now. Indeed, and that's maybe what we can do now next. What happens when an artist organization collaborates with an arts institution, and what are the mutual challenges there, could be an interesting field to also maybe test some of our concerns or some of our imagination about arts institution. And maybe just with an example, as I said before, Sarah is initiated this long-term organization called Bodies of Knowledge, which is, I think, very much in the line of what you, Florian, described as artist organizations. And recently, the work of Bach was presented by the Kunsten Festival des Arts in Brussels. So that's where Bach operates. And for me, there was an interesting friction in between, in a way, the needs of this project and organization, which is very much based on continuity. For example, Bach, Bodies of Knowledge is a kind of school which during COVID became took place in form of walks in a park in Scharbeck, one of the municipalities of Brussels, which was really very much based on repetition and walking circular paths and one-to-one with people who come, who don't have a voice or whose voice is not valued in society, who become teachers and then kind of audience learners who become audience and learners for them. And when it was framed by the festival, of course, it also had to fit the temporality of the festival, which is very different from what the project, in a way, demands. And I found this example interesting because on the one hand, it shows very clearly what some arts institutions cannot or cannot yet do, because still the festival was happening in those 4 weeks and could not exceed its own limit in order to embrace this project as it should be embraced, while at the same time, Rock itself started before and continued after the festival. So in a way, created its own temporality, using the support from arts institutions, Kunsten, but now also Kite Theater and others in Brussels, in order to support some phases of its work and yet working autonomously and independently in order to create the conditions that it needs. And I see that maybe as a possible indication also of possible forms of collaboration between independent organizations, civic organizations, and institutions, which I'm maybe a bit optimistic, but I think is what we should look at, where maybe change can happen. I will leave it here for now. Thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Yeah, I think what you said at the end is quite maybe a good link also to Florian, because when you describe how, for example, a project like Sarah Van Hay's Bodies of Knowledge, in short, BOK, is collaborating with institutions, and Florian said in the beginning, most of the artist organizations were created or conceived also as an opposition to what was how the collaboration with institutions looked like, maybe, and also to create long-term projects or not projects. But I also was wondering, how exactly this a change of working as an artist or an artist company changed the relation to institutions, and also the other way around. If institutions are really, changing their structures, are willing to change their structures, are willing to incorporate all these claims of changes structurally, what kind of effect has it to what we might call duties, to their duties? So how much effect is what you call, they're also responsible for creating collective aesthetic experiences. And because my current experience is sometimes that organizations are so busy with, or might be busy with incorporating, and then there's the artists or the art product they produce are all on the same line of criticality and political change. And I'm not sure anymore what my aesthetic experience could be that they produce. So let's say one step back. So what is the relation between artist organizations or a change of artistic work also from project to a long-term organization, also what you described, Silvia, with Sarah Van Hay, towards institutions? And how could they learn? How could these institutions learn from this kind of changes?
Well, it's a big question, of course, but maybe I take it from. Because you mentioned the aesthetic experience, and you mentioned it was mentioned before in the talk. Somehow there's this fear that the aesthetic experience somehow is disappearing. And while I, of course, I understand what you mean, and at the same time I don't understand it. So I really have a big problem, because it means also because the aesthetic experience in this is for me very obscure. Maybe we would have to talk about concrete examples, or at least try to grasp it out. So I still cannot, especially in the field of theater and performance, I don't have the mental capacity to think of the aesthetic experience separate from, for example, the social experience. And that's maybe the main focus. So how we come together is for me the core of each performance, and it is for me then, and what you say, in the core of a festival, for example, or an institution. And in this lies the aesthetic experience for me in the core. So it's like never separable in a way. And I have difficulties. So I really have difficulties of separating these two things. Even though I know that maybe current discourses and current political, also of course, negotiation of power bring to the front certain aspects that are become dominant and that push away other things. That's part. I think also the institutions and the artworks are part of a bigger political struggle happening at the moment, with the labels of identity politics, etc. There's no outside to it, and I think, and there's also not, in this regard, I think it's also important, and maybe we didn't talk enough about this, since we're talking about context, in this context, there's a bigger context outside, and we play, the institutions and the artistic work plays one role in these bigger struggles, and are driven by certain struggles. And I think it's a bit, for me, an illusion to think like we with our institutions, are they artist organizations or art organizations, could be outside of this, and we are part of a certain wave sometimes, and suddenly and not and cannot make an, have an abstract idea, but we would rather like the situation to be like this or that. Sorry, I'm a bit abstract at the moment. I'm trying to think what my discomfort with this notion of, but where is the aesthetic experience that keeps repeating? So I was a bit avoiding the question. Sorry.
Can I try to respond to you? Because I don't see the aesthetic experience as disconnected from the social experience. On the very contrary, and I think indeed the question of how we come together and where and when and for how long, is very much part of the aesthetic experience, especially of what I keep calling the aesthetic experience as festivals or arts institutions can provide. In the sense of, maybe a couple of different examples, and maybe I just make 2 examples, which are also very much connected to the context, which is indeed also complex, question, because what is the context of an artistic institution? Of course, it's the social, political, cultural context of the city and maybe the region where the institution operates, but it's also the artistic context. I think indeed that the relation with the context is one of the, also one of the tools that arts institutions have, and that artists alone normally do not have. Although maybe when they create organizations, they also claim and take that possibility of indeed creating relations between certain artworks and certain contexts. So, one of my examples in my experience as a spectator was attending this piece by Bushra Wizgan called Corbeau. So it's a beautiful piece by a Moroccan choreographer with women taking over a public space for 30 minutes with a dance made of sound and movement, and then just disappearing as a flock of birds. So this was a bit the image. And I saw the performances several times. We also presented it. And seeing it in Europe and then seeing it in Beirut, for example, gave me 2 very different experiences and gave me a sense, in a way, of what this performance can do in relation to context. So I remember attending this work in the center of Beirut, in a place where young teenagers were normally playing and skating, and they really saw this powerful group of women very gently taking over their space completely, and then just giving and giving it back to them, yet completely transformed. So the temperature of the air was very different, and it was a context also with international professionals and stuff, and with local people just walking, taking a stroll in the street. So the context, made an impact on me, and I guess also my presence in a way made an impact on the other people there, because there were people like me watching at it, while there were also people just being angry at somebody taking over their place, or there were old men being a bit in discomfort because of these women, etc. So it is indeed about how we come together. It is indeed about the relation with the context, even with the context of the city, with the cultural context, the social context, etc. So the realities. But it is about sometimes connecting certain artworks to certain places and what can spring from that. Or if I think of organizations or again maybe festivals that are working more in the sense of creating a sense of festival as an artwork itself, as a collective intellect operating over some days and working with duration and time in ways that it is not a fixed program, but things are happening over day and night, as you also did with Truth is Concrete, for example. This creates indeed a sense of, the bodily sense, which is very different than just attending a program, and the sense of, indeed, of a collective intellect for me, which to me is part of what I call an aesthetic experience, because of how unpredictable it becomes, because of a sense of it could go everywhere, and nobody is in control, and we don't know yet what it is. I think when I talk about aesthetic experiences, I'm not talking about beauty but I think I'm really talking about this sense of we don't know what it is, and maybe we cannot say, we cannot define it. It's undefinable, it's undecidable what it is. And it is an us who owns it together, yet not living exactly the same thing. Just saying, so yeah, it's not separate from the social
Can you then maybe give a more concrete example of, so I'm not quite sure what you mean when you talk about the dangers of this getting lost, and maybe you can be a bit more concrete where you see, give examples of this getting lost.
Yeah, you say, I just think that working within artistic institutions lately, I have seen myself, maybe also, and I've seen other people becoming less and less capable of being confident about this kind of experience that arts institution can facilitate. And of course, together with the artists, and of course, putting the artworks in the forefront. It's about serving that. And then becoming more and more busy with, indeed, how to react to certain sets of demands that are put on them, and also a bit paralyzed in relation to the many issues, societal issues that indeed arts institutions have to tackle, and to, of course, to contribute, let's say, to a better ways of living together. But I think trust, keeping the confidence and trust also in this kind of experiences, to me, very empowering for us and for the artists. And that's maybe my concern, or where I see the danger, is also that then arts institutions are made equal to other kind of institutions or organizations where, in a sense, for me, they are not. So I'm very glad if the project that we do also has some kind of social impact on specific, let's say, people, individuals or communities, but at the same time, as we all, I guess, know very well, more and more we as institutions, in a way, are asked to serve these purposes, because, in a way, there is an idea that if we do it with art, it's cheaper and faster, and it is not, and the real social work is not cheap and is not fast. And I think what indeed we can do is, on the one hand, the institution really working carefully on the inside, but on the other hand, not being too busy with ourselves, which is, I guess, never a good idea, but to trust the kind of experience that we can provide, and in a way to trust that we cannot measure what it does to people, but it does something. And it does something extremely valuable, because no other field of experience can provide that. To me, that's really peculiar to what arts can do. But this is me, and of course, this is questionable.
I wonder, because I heard already your lecture, for example, that you had about festivals, and you are very much stressing the term of collective experience also. And listening to you, I wonder if what you are now also saying, and also saying about the responsiveness of an institution to be used. Sarah van Heijn did also say, I think in this very lecture she made in a fantastic institution, that she complained about not being asked what she needs, only offered with concrete things. But so this responsiveness that creates something together, it is, I have to think, rather on collaboration somehow, also that institutions keep a certain kind of flexibility, openness, responsiveness, in order to create together. Is that what you also mean with a collective? And also, only that what we sometimes maybe forget is the audience as a player in it, if we talk about collectiveness, right? That should be taken in consideration. But yeah.
Yeah, to me, from my perspective, I mean, yes to collaboration, and of course, yes to institution asking artists and, or I mean, listening more than proposing. Absolutely. When I talk about an aesthetic experience, I think that I guess an aesthetic experience as provided by an arts institution is always more than just an individual experience, and yes, and yet it is a kind of singular experience. And to me, the political value is that it's not collective in the sense that we all experience the same thing. And I think indeed the power of art is that we don't experience the same. We have not seen the same thing. We have not felt the same things. And yet we share this space, and we share this time, and we share the presence of each other, and we are aware of each other. And to me, this is, which is, for me, ideally what institutions should offer, which is not one experience for the same experience for everybody, because there is no such a thing as one collectivity, luckily, but in a way to provide experiences that are, in a way, potentially as aesthetic experiences, open for everybody, and because they don't belong to anybody in particular. And then, of course, I mean, this is very abstract in the sense that, okay, who has access to it, what are the barriers, etc. These are all very relevant questions. But still, the moment this encounters occurs, I think there is a sense of a collectivity not as one thing, but a sense of collectivity as radical differences within it. So maybe for me, this image, I just stick to that of Beirut and the teenagers and the old couples, we all sharing the same thing, and of course we were not having the same experience, but also being aware of each other, for me, had a huge impact on how I could, on my own experience of that. And I think this was maybe in different degrees, but this was mutual. So there is also, in a way, a power that as spectators we have of defining what that is happening, which to me contributes to that sense of the collectivity not as one thing. I can say so.
You want to respond, right?
No, I mean, of course, I agree with basically everything, but sometimes the question is. But one thing I would say, because you said like accountability, and so I think there are two different things. One is the demands by whatever entities give the money, by the state, by whatever, like to do all these things, which I would very much agree on that this might threaten certain freedom and so on. The other thing which actually really paralyzes the institutions are not these. These are young artists, activists, and discourse they bring in, and they paralyze institutions at the moment with a very often very rigid demands. And that's an interesting situation. I mean, I can say yes. I see the problems of these demands also, and of course I'm also quite sure. I mean, as a middle-aged white man, I'm very much challenged by them. But it's a different situation. It's a demand that doesn't come from the state. It's a demand that comes from, in my experience, from artists, from artists of a certain generation. And then we and I mean, I feel it in many ways. But then, as institutions, to say, yeah, but that's now a little bit much because we want. So it's also interesting to see that the challenge of the institution changes, and suddenly there's a challenge to the institution that is not maybe the one. To talk about me, that is not the one I was growing up with, putting as an institution. It's a different one, but we still have to see. I think that's an interesting and complex situation. Just we don't like this challenge, maybe to a degree. We have to acknowledge, and yeah. So I just think that's the situation and the tricky situation we are in. And again, I would say that's an unanswerable question, as it was said today. At the same time, the interesting thing with the unanswerable question is that it's unanswerable and has to be answered at the same moment, which is maybe another level of complication in this. And again, I would say sometimes also as institutions and as art workers, we have to, and cultural workers, we have to in a way zoom out and see, and not only in terms of the landscape at the moment, but also in terms of time. I think there are certain temporalities also crashing at the moment. And there are certain demands that don't have time. I mean, you talk about one, others would be the demands due to climate change and so on, which are very urgent. And we are stuck in them, but sometimes I think we should also try to see, these are newly renegotiated. And we are in a moment where these paradigms are negotiated. That doesn't mean that this will be the future, but that we are stuck in a certain struggle at the moment as institutions also, or working with institutions.
But only, you say demand, but what kind of demands are these? We are again in this, is this a political, there are political demands, and I'm totally with you when you're saying there's something strange to single this aesthetic experience out and to disconnect it from political or ethical questions, but at the same time, these demands are structural, right? You are now referring to
their demands for criteria, which is partly structural and partly aesthetic and so on. And I think maybe the problem is they have not clear demands for other. It's often just say your criteria don't work anymore, and it's a finding out what could work instead in a way, and that's a problematic situation. I think that's really interesting. But I think being stuck in this is also very productive, and I think it's also artistically very productive.
Exactly being productive?
No, that we cannot, like maybe the word stuck is wrong, that we cannot escape these questions. I would say that's the challenge, that's the artistic challenge also, and the institutional challenge is not to say, like, no, but to say, okay, how do we deal with them? What artistic work does this produce? What criteria, what aesthetics this work has? Or what does it lead to? I mean, a situation where we don't know where it leads to is of course frightening, but what could be more productive?
Silvia, you did only one of your two examples, right? But I just saw the time, and I also would like to open up for questions. Is it okay? Yeah, that we. If there are questions, you're very, very welcome. Or comments, or continuing thoughts? No? Thank you. Yes.
Silvia. Silvia, you opened your talk today with a little bit of skepticism in terms of your engagement with the institution that you're working with now. And am I right? Is she here?
Do you hear
Hey, hi Nicolina. So I didn't hear you super well.
Okay, is it better?
Yeah, this is better.
Sorry, talking through the mask, so probably you heard Okay, you opened your talk today with a kind of skepticism as to your further engagement with the institution that you are working in at the moment. Am I right?
Actually, there was criticism, yes, and it's not an institution that I'm working with, but I resigned from an institution recently.
So you already resigned. I wanted to ask you because you also kind of, at the same time, kind of said that it's important to not to leave. You called it Chantal Mouffe and
No.
said, yeah. I wanted to ask you what, maybe this is an intimate question and maybe you don't want to answer, but what drove you, like what are the conditions under which you actually decided to then leave the institution?
Thank you for the question. And of course, it's also intimate, but I think it's also not just about me and maybe useful to share. And in a way, it also goes back to what Florian was saying about what paralyzes the institution. And to me, in the end, I think it was this sense of paralysis and also of powerlessness that I was experiencing as a person who was in a position of power, at least on paper, within an institution. But when I found myself in this, I had to deal with a sense of paralysis of the institution itself vis-à-vis certain set of demands that were, from my perspective, also very legitimate. So it is an educational institution now. So on the one hand, it's really nationally founded, so it has to implement national policies that people working in the institution just have to implement. In a way, that's how it works. And at the same time, within an educational institution, of course, you engage also with a lot of peers, artists come and teach, team members, and also students who, in that case, were young international artists relocating to the Netherlands for their studies. So also a lot of, let's say, political questions and a lot of different sensitivities and different backgrounds were there in the school. And I think in the end, what really scared me was this sense of not having, being in a position of power without having agency, really, and then not, and that was maybe my limit also, my incapability, not being able in a way to drop what, because I think there are things that in some institutions should just drop what they are doing and respond to what is there. But within a big national institution, I found that was, of course, very difficult to do. And at the same time, and maybe especially during the whole COVID pandemic, it became for me very urgent. And in a way, the conflict between the demands from the artists, students in that case, and the patterns and the ways of working of the institution was unconsiderable at some point. And I didn't feel supported by the institution when I tried to tackle those demands. So this is what gave me a sense of unworkability. And of course, it's a contradiction in relation to what I said, but it's also, as you said, very private, and it's about, sometimes it's about surviving or being in places where you can do what you think you should be doing. And that's why I thank you for the question. I think it's important also to reflect about these experiences.
It's also, we keep working with contradictions, because what takes the lever is there that way.
You understood? You understood it? Yes, please take the microphone. Or
thank you both for all the inputs that you already made. I have a simple question following this division between symbolic and actual work of an institution. So, okay, how do we move from this? So on one side, doing representational critical work, but on the other side, keeping institutions as they are. And also, sub-question to this, isn't it actually that if nothing changes in the institution, that also this symbolic level is pretty much conditioned by the fact that nothing will change, institutionally and structurally. So that the way how, let's say, symbolic criticism or in whatever direction, accessibility, diversity, climate questions, and so on and so forth, isn't that actually conditioned by the fact that at the end things will remain the same?
somebody likes to answer to that?
First, maybe Florian, you go first. No, I mean, just not to take that space.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yes. That's the answer. But maybe I answered it indirectly with the again anecdotal in a way, because I found it quite interesting. So in Berlin, there is this very contested theater of the Volksbühne, which was the famous place of Castor, and then the Sterkon came, visual arts, and there was a big fight, and now René Polish is back, continuing it a little bit, and then changing and so on. So it's an interesting example of a big municipal theater that at the same time, and this is maybe also something you have to consider, and there are several institutions, and it's maybe also a bit different if you're an institution somewhere and you're the only one in the landscape, then your responsibility and how you deal with it is different, or are there several others and everybody could also maybe try out something else. So Volksbühne is a big theater, and it's a proscenium and all this kind of thing, and at the same time there are other theaters around, and it's a bit the symbolic place. And there's a group that occupied the space during the Sterkon period called Staub zu Glitzer, Dust to Glitter, they are in a way an artist organization because their occupation they consider to be a performance. So their occupation was a performance at the same time, kind of. And René Polish, taking over the Volksbühne, always said he would acknowledge their demands and include them. But they say, listen, yeah, but we are not includable. We have a demand that we want to run this place. So it's not done by giving us a lecture, a series of talks in the Rote Salon, which is one of the venues or whatever. It's like, so what you can do is, you can invite us and we will start a process, talking with all the staff and so on, but the end of the process is very clear. You will lose your job, basically. So everything else, if you don't acknowledge this, you're not even coming. Because it doesn't make sense. Because we just would re-establish the institution that will not change in a way. Which I found a very interesting problem, because it brings to the point all the questions. What kind of institutions would it be? Would there be good art afterwards or not? And who would run it? And etc. So you can see all this in there. But as a demand, I think it's in a way beautiful. The demand is already an aesthetic experience, I would say, also in this case. And of course, the way out would be René Polish would say yes, and he would have an exit, and you would just go somewhere else, and you would be the brave director who enabled this change. But that's something else. But the radicality of the demand is interesting, and I don't know how productive it will be, because it's of course in a way marginal. It will stay marginal if they don't win, but it's a whole question: should they enter the institution or not, and under which conditions should they enter this institution?
Maybe if I can add, I'm also maybe playing this game, Florian, that we can now let you, I think your example is super interesting, and how the actual and the symbolic, the real and the symbolic are inseparable, and maybe then I try to play with the devil advocate in the sense of, I mean, another perspective could be indeed to separate and to, because I think an institution, exactly because it is an institution, has to work both on the symbolic and on the actual level, so in a way cannot withdraw from any of them. And I'm very much in a way busy with the second part of your question, because I think it's super important how the symbolic level is conditioned by the sense that nothing will change in the actual level. I think indeed the responsibility of changing the institutions in their actual level, in the way they work, is also very much needed in order to free the imagination, to free the symbolic level. I don't know if I got you right, but I had to think of my experience in a school in Das, where, for example, in these 3 years I saw many artists coming in, so they are young artists, I mean young and not so young, artists coming from different continents, so coming into the program, which is a master program meant to help them develop their own work, and suddenly becoming extremely busy with the institution of the school. Very often to the point that a lot of, let's say, let's call it their creativity, I don't like this word very much, but anyway, their potential was really stuck, and so it doesn't become useful. And I think in this sense, changing and implementing actual changes in the institution would also free them and free their imagination from the fact that they have to engage with it, because they have to refuse, they have to criticize, and maybe they have to build alternatives, which for some of them might be the thing that they want to do, but for some others this is not. And what they, as artists, or what they were busy with and probably wanted to keep busy with is other kind of artistic work and other kind of artistic experimentation and stuff. And then I see that sometimes in a way they start working again when they get out of the school, because the moment that they are busy with the institution, and also in a very peculiar position within the institution, this sense of unchangeability of the institution triggers something which is maybe sometimes also useful as part of the education, but sometimes becomes, in a way, takes too much energy, to put it very, very simply. So in that sense, I would say, as people working in institutions, we should be very aware of these two different layers, and know that the more we can change the actual levels, the more, in a way, we can also free the symbolic level. And more importantly for me, we should not only charge as you were also saying, I guess, in your example, Florian, I mean, load the symbolic level where the changes happens there. So yes, nice cycle of lectures and you have space, etc. But for me, thinking in terms of separation helps. And of course, the difficult exercise is that institutions have to engage with both.
I just think it's also interesting that when you talk about these examples in Das Art or Das Theater, that when I was mentioning the phases of institutional critique before, it's of course obvious that institutional critique was not really taking place in the performing arts. Very few examples, I would say, are there. And maybe now related, which maybe changed, it's also interesting also to see how the discourse is different maybe in the field of performing arts and in the visual arts. And maybe part of the problem now is some of the discourse is imported a little bit from the visual arts towards the performing arts and so on. But I think it's interesting that this now comes, and maybe it comes too late, or maybe actually the second wave institutional critique arrives now, where actually it's already in the fourth wave or whatever. But why is this happening now, and to what degree in performing arts?
Yeah, I also thought that it's not really embodied this kind of, I mean, we read a lot and we heard a lot, but we didn't really practice this kind of critique within building up institutions. And at the same time, there's this kind of institutionalization or professionalization also of arts education going on, but it's a different kind of development at the same time. But
but it's very interesting to think about the problems of these internal conflicts, as Silvia mentioned when she was talking about her experience with the institution, where you have a number of different demands, and they're basically making the institution unworthy. That somehow the institution has to continue to work, but not for the purposes of those who are using the institution as such. And funny enough, less people are present in the institutions, the demands are growing. You know, once you engage people full time within the institutions, they have less demands. You know, and it's a kind of classical exploratory type of relation to people. You know, if you engage them full time, they will not have time to think about their issues and problems.